as a student came in, class hadn't even started yet, but he's like one of the last people to come walking in. And as soon as he walked in, he said, "Thank you, Father, for this study." Because I thought he missed class. I steal my joke. So, well, welcome everyone. My name is Richard Howe. My wife Rebecca is roaming around, not sure which breakout she's going to be at, but she's already heard this one plenty of times. So she's the one with the real unusual looking crutches. If you've seen her walking around, the weight bears on the elbow rather than the wrist. So ask her about those crutches and she'll tell you the story about them and why she has them and these kind of things. So the title of this is Faith and Reason. So hopefully it's not going to be a choice between the two. Like, would you like faith or reason? Would you like an order of fries with that? To go. I guess I'd like some faith to go, please. Also, just so you'll know, I'm hoping that because of the way this podium is strategically placed, I can actually read my notes without my glasses. Because I can't see anything if it's very close. But if I surreptitiously do this, it's because it's too blurry for me to read. It doesn't mess up the recording. I'm welcoming the home audience here. Welcome everyone. All right, so this issue of faith and reason is something that has come to mean a lot to me in terms of the debate surrounding that in some small ponds in which I run, in terms of, well, what exactly is faith as a Christian particularly, and how does that compare and contrast with reason, whatever that means, whatever either of those mean. Isaiah 1:18 says, if I got the reference right, "Come, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall be as wool." In contrast, or in comparison, Hebrews 11:6 says, "But without faith, it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him." So you have these two verses, one employing the concept of reason, whatever that means, and one employing the concept of faith. So let me define these terms, only one definition of which is relevant for what I want to talk about today in connecting the two. There's a common sort of definition of faith that you and I use, I think, where faith is just as another word for religion. So somebody says, "Oh, he's of the Christian faith," or "he's of the Muslim faith," or the Hindu faith. So it's just more or less a synonymous term for religion in general. There's a theological use of the term, one of the theological virtues, and I would suggest that's kind of what the Hebrews passage is employing. But you also see it in verses like Ephesians 2:8 that says, "For by grace are you saved through faith." And note that in your English translation, sometimes the verb of the noun from that same Greek word might be translated with the word faith, or it might be translated belief, or the verb, have faith, or the verb believe, these kind of things. So you think of something like Romans 4, verses 4 and 5 that says, "To him who works, the wages are not counted as a gift, but as a debt. But to him who does not work, but believes in Him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness." So, interestingly, in the Greek, the English verb believe, he who believes, and the English noun faith are the same word in Greek, just one's the verb form and one is the noun form. So that's sort of a theological use of the term. Then there's more of what a philosopher would call an epistemological use. And I like the word epistemology because you get to spit on people. And you can get away with it. Going, "Oh, man, you just spit on me." So sorry, I was just doing some philosophy for you. So it just comes with the territory. But epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with how we know things, asking questions of how do I know what I know, as opposed to questions like what ought I do, which would be ethics, or what is this thing, which would be metaphysics and these kind of things. So it's this epistemological knowledge kind of connection of faith that I want to explore a little bit in this comparison and contrast with reason. And I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I have a vested interest in the subject by virtue of the fact that I am a philosopher. So that's my hobby horse that I ride all the time. So both my master's degree and my PhD are in philosophy from two different state universities. When we're off the clock and we're not taking time from the breakout session, a lot of people are interested to know, well, what's it like to do philosophy at a state university when you're a Christian. I think a lot of people would be surprised how many Christians there are in state university philosophy departments around the United States. In fact, the running joke at my house when we're watching Saturday college football, very often I root for the team based on who I know teaches in the philosophy department. It's like Oklahoma, oh, Linda Subzewski, she's the president of the Society of Christian Philosophy. Got to go for Oklahoma if they're playing somebody else. So I do that all the time and run that joke into the ground. So now, having said a little bit about faith, it's going to have something to do with knowledge and how we know things. Let me say a few words about reason before then I want to go through a litany of various different ways of understanding how they relate, compare, contrast, in order to lobby ultimately for one particular, this is what I think is how they should relate. I'll give you that case for that in due course. But again, very common in our society, people might use the word reason as something that is opposed to religion. So that religion is something that is you acquire in spite of, maybe in some people's minds, the application of reason. That's not an uncommon. And that it's something that is to the exclusion of faith in some sense of that term. There's a more technical, philosophical ways the word reason is used, and that may have very attenuated range of meaning and application that may or may not matter to us as we go along. But you want to be careful that, or I want to be careful at least, that when I lobby for some role that reason plays in the Christian life, that I'm not opting for the philosophical model known as rationalism, with a capital R. I generally designate it for my students. Because rationalism as a philosophy is basically going to say that some faculties of reason are our only access to truth, and that anything other than that is something that either doesn't have anything to do with true or false, like whether you like Haagen-Dazs ice cream or not, whatever the example, or it's something that's just not even real, as some people would go so far to say that if it can't be accessed by whatever the faculties of reason are, then it's just not real at all. Now, maybe I should have started with this, but you're already here, so you're probably too shy to get up and walk out after we've already started. But let me lobby for why I think this matters. What's at stake? I'll give you one example of why what at one level may seem like a pedantic, ivory tower, or academic exercise is actually life and death. In the Middle Ages, both Christianity and Islam, and I don't know enough about Judaism with respect to this issue, but I know enough about what happened in Christianity through the Middle Ages and Islam, that both religions examined and battled over and explored the contours of how do faith and reason relate. By and large, Islam, basically Sunni Islam, decided on the priority of faith, and for them that meant the Quran, the word of Allah, over reason. And I think an argument can be made, in fact an argument that has been made, and I'll suggest a resource for you, that it at that time then arrested Islamic culture in any further cultural development. Because prior to this middle part of the Middle Ages, prior to that, Islam was at the vanguard of a lot of things in cultural development, in literature, in philosophy, in the natural sciences and stuff. But by maybe as late as the 16th century, that development had been arrested. And so Islam, by and large, at least Sunni, was no longer open to new ideas in things like private property, or individual liberty, or capitalism, or diplomacy, in these things. And they've been arrested. And so some would argue some of the things that we're battling with ISIS and stuff is because they're behaving the way pretty much every nation behaved in the 9th and 10th century. The way you coexisted was conquer your neighbors and take their stuff. That's how you flourished as a nation. And so, but Christian Europe decided that there is a symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship, whatever that ends up being, between faith and reason. And it allowed Christian Europe to be open to new ideas like the Galileo affair. It took maybe a couple of centuries, but eventually we moved from believing that the sun is moving across the sky and the earth is immovable, which was the old Ptolemaic and Ptolemaic and Aristotelian model, right? And we all learned that eventually with Copernicus and then Galileo and then the mathematicians kind of pushed it over the finish line. We all came to believe, well, actually, it's the earth that's rotating and the sun relative to the earth is standing still. And it was a pretty interesting debate that raged, not only scientifically, but also philosophically and theologically. But despite all that, eventually Christian Europe was open to these new ideas like that, like heliocentrism and other things in terms of moving away from feudalism to a more marketplace economy and private property and these kind of things. So if that matters to us, practically speaking, do we care about contemporary Islamic terrorism? We go, well, historically speaking, this all found its origins in this battle over, well, is there some role that reason can play that sets certain boundaries to what we think is believable with respect to what we think our faith is telling us? And are we going to allow ourselves to entertain points of view that maybe my faith up to this point was saying maybe I shouldn't entertain that, like the sun is actually moving when the sun is actually standing still as opposed to moving. That people, they denied that kind of move on the basis of Scripture. When Joshua 10 says that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, Bellarmine against Galileo said, well, obviously the Bible teaches that the sun is moving, because you can't command something to stand still if it's not moving. So if the scientists are telling us the sun is not moving, then it's clearly in violation of the Bible. Now everybody understands that's just language of appearance. That's how we understand that. Just like when Joel chapter 2 says that the moon will turn to blood. I don't know anybody that's ever believed in the history of Christianity that the moon was actually become liquid, and have plasma and corpuscles and stuff. And nobody ever thought anything other than that's the language of appearance. It turns red like blood is red. So I think that's at least one thing that's at stake. If you're interested in that thesis, then I would commend to you the book called The Closing of the Muslim Mind by Robert Riley. And you can actually hear Professor Riley lecture on this on YouTube. I think the breakfast I had this morning is actually on YouTube. Now it's already there. Everything ends up on YouTube. So that's what's at stake, all right, in terms of this battle. So now what I'd like to do is just give you a few examples of what I think are wrong views of a relationship of faith and reason before I lobby for what I call the classical view of that. If you are... oftentimes I do a PowerPoint, and sometimes I even do balloon animals, which are really fun. Except for the balloon animals I do on the attributes of God, because that omnipresence, that balloon's pretty hard to blow up, so I don't do that one. But you can get a PDF document that's of all my slides on this. So here's my real self-serving part of the lecture. So you'll want to go to richardghowe.com. Richard G. Don't leave out the G. I can't guarantee what website you'll land on.
Richard G.
Richard G. It stands for good looking. Okay, just for the home viewers, everybody just burst out into laughter, and I'm not really sure why.
How do you spell your last name?
Howe. Howe. richardghowe.com. Okay? Now, when you get to the front page, you'll see tabs across the top. You'll want to go to Resources. And then there you'll have the options, one of which is PDF slide decks. All that is the PowerPoint that's just turned into a PDF document. All right, so there are like 1,000,006 there from the classes I teach and other things that I speak on in different venues. So you'll just scroll down and get the one that's on faith and reason. It'll have something like that in the title. It'll give you, because I'm going to have a few citations, and you may be curious, hey, I didn't quite write that quote down, or where did he say, what page was that on? You can go to the slide deck and get that. In addition, there will be a lot of slides there that I don't even bring up today for time constraints, which has actually tempted me when I do one of these. I think I would love to just stick a slide right in the middle of a presentation that's totally irrelevant to anything. And people think, well, I didn't hear the lecture, so I'm sure it had some, just to see if anybody will, hey, well, listen to your thing about faith and reason. So what is that watermelon point about faith and reason? Got a picture of a watermelon there. I think that because we love watermelon.
There's got to be a reason
around this area. There's got to be some reason for watermelon, exactly. So the first one that I want to dismiss as an inappropriate view is probably the most common that I've run into, that I call just the popular misconception. There are all kinds of misconceptions. This is what I call the popular misconception of faith and reason. It's best illustrated, if you're old enough, in the movie Miracle on 34th Street. So you guys remember, they may have remade it, but I'm talking about the original one back in 1950 when I was watching it. I didn't get that on tape when how old I am. But you remember the lawyer, Fred Gailey, and then Doris Walker, and they're falling in love, and she's real analytic and bookish, and that kind of intellectual type, and he's really happy-go-lucky. So as they fall in love, that becomes a conflict where she's thinking he's throwing away his potential career because he's going to defend pro bono this old man who thinks he's Kris Kringle, right? And she thinks that's just ludicrous. It's foolish. And doesn't make sense. And the tagline about halfway through the movie, sort of one of the preliminary climaxes of the movie, is when he's trying to reason with her, ironically, look, faith, you just have to have faith in me. And he says, faith is believing in something when common sense tells you not to. Yeah, it doesn't make sense that I would defend this guy and potentially throw away a lucrative legal career. But, that's just what faith is. And I think a lot of people, certainly in my experience, people have this idea that faith is just something, that will strike you as doesn't make sense, maybe even as absurd. And so that's kind of what's so virtuous about it. You actually see it in things other than just fictional movies like that. I know for a long time, Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, was a person of note in not only the books that he wrote with the Da Vinci Code and the Angels and Demons, some of which were made into movies, but also public lectures. And I have a great quote from him that basically just says, I had to struggle with religion versus science. And science was real rational and wanted me to demonstrate things, but religion just wanted me to take, quote, everything on faith, he said. Just take everything, almost like he was implying that it's just a blind lead. And unfortunately, I think this kind of misunderstanding, what I call this popular misconception of it, is not uncommon in the church. I mean, I put Dan Brown, he's not even a Christian. The movie wasn't even a Christian movie. Okay, we can give him a pass. But at least in my experience, I've run into too many Christians that think that. And they think there's something inherently virtuous in them coming to believe things that are absurd. They think that's sort of part of the whole package. If I'm going to buy into Christianity, I got to believe just about every wacky thing that somebody tells me the Bible teaches. Another misconception is the atheists. There's really two different categories of atheism. I teach a course at our seminary. Here's another shameless plug that you can audit if it cycles back around before you forget, on contemporary atheism. And I divide the category of atheism into popular atheism, that's your street kind of atheism, non-academic. And then the new atheism, I'm sure you guys are familiar with that phenomenon. It's kind of run its course now. It's not quite as novel as it was. With Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris were the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse. And they called themselves the new atheism. Listen to what Sam Harris, who is no small intellect of his own right, brilliant and incredibly gifted public speaker, says, quote, religious faith is the belief in historical and metaphysical propositions without sufficient evidence. He goes on, faith is the mortar that fills the crack in the evidence and the gaps in the logic. And thus it is faith that keeps the whole terrible edifice of religious certainty still looming dangerously over our world. In fact, there's a banner that made the rounds in some circles that said, science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings. I thought, that is powerful, rhetorically powerful, but it exhibits, I think, a misunderstanding. And it's probably not the atheist's fault. If I'm right that there are too many Christians that have this popular misunderstanding, then it's maybe to be expected that when the atheist is trying to acquaint himself with what do these Christians think, they run into that in the marketplace and they think, well, no wonder. Richard Dawkins, the famous new atheist, said, quote, faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and Brooks no argument, unquote. So remember those kind of characterizations. But also another category is just a broader sense of atheism, the academic atheist, which was probably what most people would have run into 50 or more years ago. The only atheists that you would know about, likely, that had any kind of public face would have been in the academics, the professional atheist philosophers. And we deal with those in the class as well. And Bertrand Russell, probably the most important philosopher of mathematics and logic, certainly of the 20th century, if not ever. Brilliant again. So I'm not trying to imply somehow that these people are stupid. But nevertheless, Bertrand Russell says, quote, "As regards the kind of belief, it is thought virtuous to have faith. That is to say, to have a conviction which cannot be shaken by contrary evidence. Or, if contrary evidence might induce doubt, it is held that contrary evidence must be suppressed." Unquote. That's what he thought we think. And there are other quotes there from various atheists that you can get, again, from the slide deck, including from people like George Smith, probably the best popular atheist book I've ever read. I required reading in the class, called Atheism, the Case Against God. Peter Boghossian, who's made a name for himself recently, I say recently, in the past few years, in his fight against critical theory. So he was a liberal academic that realized how toxic that was. So ironically, when he was writing and speaking against Christianity because of his atheism, at some point, I think, and this is just me speculating, I think he went, you know what, the Christians aren't really the problem here. It's the academics that are the problem with this critical theory. And he was a victim of that. He got basically fired from his job because he tried to teach students how to think critically. So he's turned his laser beam intellect onto critical theory and away from, he's like, I'm not too worried about the Christians and their theism anymore. So you can get quotes from there. You also have organizations or movements, like for example, there was a big movement that impacted Christianity for more than a century. We're still feeling sort of aftershock from some of this movement called Neo-Orthodoxy, which grew out of late 19th century German theology, people like Karl Barth, for example. And Karl Barth, who was a famous New Testament scholar, had a debate with a guy named Emil Brunner, who was also a famous German scholar, and they had a debate over this issue of faith and reason. And what, if anything, we could by reason know to be true about God. That was kind of what's called natural theology. Are there things that we can naturally know that are true about God apart from a revealed truth like the Bible? That was their debate. And it's in print. It wasn't like a public, they wrote, and you can get it in English translation. But Barth's contribution to the debate was titled, "No!" That was the name with a big exclamation point. No, you can't know anything like that. You can't do it at all. And he extols what he thinks are the vices of even the attempt as a Christian now to try to do natural theology. That is, to try to say, are there things that we could demonstrate to be true apart from our Bible as Christians? And he was insistent that you couldn't do that. And it had no small effect on American Christianity eventually. Barth's disciples eventually, their influence spills over. And I remember as a college student, I actually lost my faith in college. So I was born in the South. There are more Baptists in Mississippi than there are people. just to let you know. Because I think I'm on like 4 church rolls still. You can't even get off if you die. So, but I wasn't raised in the church. So here I'm growing up in the Bible Belt. They always refer to the Southeast as the Bible Belt, right? I grew up in that environment, never heard of Christ, never heard the gospel. My parents didn't go to church. As far as I think my mom was a nominal Christian. My dad, by the time I was old enough to think about these things, was atheist. He wasn't militant. But I'm just saying, I've never had that input. I came but the Lord there never was a time in my life that I can remember where I didn't believe in God's existence. But I obviously didn't understand the gospel. I can remember clearly that I didn't have a clue about my need for a Savior. And God began to deal with me, retrospectively, you look back and you realize, oh, that was God doing some stuff. You didn't know it at the time, maybe. Certainly at 14 years old, I didn't know. And for 2 years, I really had this yearning and this itch that I didn't know how to scratch. I didn't know what it meant. My mom would take me to church and drop me off because I just felt compelled to go. And so it was through influence of friends of mine in high school who helped me understand my need for the Savior, what Jesus had done for me. So I trusted Him when I was 16. So I grow about as much as you can as a 16-year-old. No offense to any 16-year-old who might be here. I was a long-haired rock and roll drummer in the 70s. Okay, so I looked like an ugly girl. Basically. That's what I looked like, especially in college. Okay? So I was a percussion minor, all this kind of stuff. But I needed a major. And somebody said, well, you can go to college, because I had gone to community college first. You can go to college and major in Bible. So I went to the flagship Baptist college. Lots of the states in the Southeast have at least one, if not more, denominational colleges. So Baptist, and you got those across the U.S., but especially in the South are the Southern Baptists. So I go to the flagship Southern Baptist College, and it was my first encounter as a teenager of skeptics who were scholars, who were Christians, but they were skeptical about their Bible and various aspects of the, quote, Christian faith. So I lost my faith, basically. I don't believe a person can lose their eternal life. I know Christians disagree on that, but I don't think that's possible. But regardless of that debate, there's a lot of things you can lose as a Christian. And I lost my confidence and my assurance, and I struggled for about a year or more. One of my favorite passages of Scripture is out of Acts. I think it's Acts 20 or Acts 18 or 20. I have to memorize it. It's one of my favorite passages, and I don't know where it is. Doesn't make any sense. I know it's in Acts. I've got that in there. I got that narrowed down. But it's the story of Apollos, and it says that Apollos was a mighty man, eloquent in the Scriptures, and he greatly helped those who believed through faith, for he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing that Jesus is the Christ. So I imagine that the new Jewish Christians were being outgunned by the scholarly Pharisees. That's not even talking about the Messiah. That's and they're like, oh man, they're maybe getting stumbled. So here comes Apollos, big cape on, big A on his shirt. What's the problem here? Well, they're saying, metaphorically speaking, intellectually, he refused the Jews right in front of them. And right in front of these Christians. And so they're seeing a scholar refute these ones that are stumbling them intellectually. And it describes it greatly helped. That's exactly what happened in my life. That God began to bring apologists. Apolli, is that the plural of apologists? Apolli. Yeah, we'll work on that. He began to bring people like Apollos into my life through their ministry, their cassette ministry. And when I speak to larger crowds, I usually have to interrupt and go, young people, cassette is this plastic thing about the size of a credit card, ran on gasoline, cassette player. But people like Norm Geisler, who was mentioned by Judge Ken in his talk a little while ago, the co-founder of our seminary, Josh McDowell, these names you'll find, R.C. Sproul. I mean, these guys were like rock stars to me. And then my two oldest brother, Don Howe, who's gone to be with the Lord, and Tom Howe, who's also on our faculty. God used them through apologetics to really get my feet planted back there over the things like a neo-orthodoxy and these other kinds of issues. All right, so what about another one? Well, here's one I don't want to spend much time. I'll just throw a few darts out there, and if they land anywhere, we can talk about it afterwards. But I would allege that presuppositionalism also has a misconception of the relationship of faith and reason. Now, presuppositionalism is what they call an apologetic method. So you have different ways of doing apologetics. And the market share of method among evangelical conservative Christians in America are the classical method, which is probably like an R.C. Sproul or Norm Geisler, and then the presuppositional method. Whatever those differences are in other respects, one of the differences, I think, is how they misunderstand faith and reason. And this is not really that uncommon in some respects, even outside the debate over apologetic method. Because you find people confusing what a philosopher would call a self-evident truth. Like if you said, like the laws of logic, you say, well, contradictions can't both be true. It can't both be raining and not raining in exactly the same way. It might be raining somewhere and not raining somewhere else, or raining here and not raining later. raining cats and dogs figuratively, but not raining water literally. It could be lots of different ways, but in exactly the same way, something can't be both true and false at the same time in exactly the same way. But a presuppositionalist will basically say, well, that's just a matter of faith as well. We just accept these laws of logic by faith. And I go, I don't think that's what faith has been understood to be, as I'll work my way to here in due course. That's not really how we've understood it. And if you just make everything bedrock, ultimately faith, if everything is that, then it seems to me that you will have problems adjudicating conflicting claims at those very basic levels. There's no common language of intercourse, as we try to say, well, at least you believe that you're not in the matrix. Some people, at least you believe that, that logic still applies to reality. Then you have something to work with. But if somebody says, well, but even your commitment to logic is a faith commitment. And you go, well, where do I go from there? Then they launch into the distinctives of their method of apologetics. Now, there's no presuppositionalist here that has an opportunity to do a breakout that I know of that gets to defend their view against my criticism. So I'm being a little uncharitable in that, because the presuppositionalists are also God-loving, Bible-believing, solid evangelical Christians. At least the ones that I know are. We just disagree over this in-house thing about method. But I think it matters a lot more. Jason Lisle, who is an astrophysicist, some of you may know Jason Lisle. He used to be with Answers in Genesis. He's a young Earth creationist. I'm young Earth creationist, but I quickly tell people I'm not a scientist. I couldn't debate Hugh Ross. I'm not a Bible scholar. And they go, well, basically the two most important relevant disciplines. So who cares whether you're young or older, basically, because you have nothing to say. But nevertheless, I just in the interest of full disclosure, but I'm young Earth, but I love Hugh Ross. And I was so glad to see that he was on the docket. Because I think God's keeping me young Earth just to disabuse my fellow young Earthers from how they vilify Hugh Ross.
Can you define young Earth?
When people would sometimes ask me how old I thought the Earth was, and I would say I'm pretty certain it's at least 66 years old. Although the first few years are on hearsay, I grant you that, but I'm pretty certain it's pretty close to that. Typically young Earthers range from about 6,000 to 10,000 years. So I'll leave those guys to debate. You can actually hear Jason Lisle and Hugh Ross debate this at one of our conferences. We have an annual conference in Charlotte every year. Which most annual things happen every year, so I'm so glad that because I would get really confused. We got an annual thing, but it only happened once. So I go, oh, you're confusing me. Here's what Jason Lisle says. He says, we all have the same evidence, but in order to draw conclusions what the evidence means, we use our worldview, our most basic beliefs about the nature of reality. Ultimately, biblical creationists accept the recorded history of the Bible as their starting point. And then he goes on. Faith is a requisite for reason. In order to reason about anything, we must have faith that there are the laws of logic which correctly prescribe the correct chain of reasoning. Since laws of logic cannot be observed with the senses, our confidence in them is a type of faith. And I would argue, no, I don't think that's true. Just because something can't be observed by the senses is not what's going to automatically make it a matter of faith, as I'll try to delineate here in just a moment. I don't think you need to know that. The adage from Thomas Aquinas, who was my philosophical mentor, I did my PhD dissertation on Aquinas' one of his arguments for God's existence. But in basically taking the cue from Aristotle, Aquinas would say, knowledge begins in the senses, but it's completed in the intellect. Whatever that means of the senses and intellect, it's enough to say, Jason, you're assuming that if I have any role that the senses play in my view of knowledge, that it's got to be able to establish everything that I know, and that the intellect doesn't have any role to play. That's why he has to find some drawer to open up and put the logic in and shut it. And the only drawer he has to do that with is faith. He just pulls that open. The logic is faith. And I go, I think there's something else going on here as I'm working towards that. Another misconception of faith is postmodernism. Now, I think lots of Christians, including me to a large extent, are used to just thinking of postmodernism, that phrase, is just another maybe fancy term for relativism. A postmodernist would be someone, and Christians have been battling moral relativism for most of the 20th into the 21st century. But a relativism about truth is fairly new to a lot of our ears, like Greg's been talking about, where somebody, well, that's true for you and not for me. Okay, well, my illustration is Brussels sprouts versus asparagus. I love steamed asparagus, but Brussels sprouts actually are post-fall. I didn't know if you knew that. They sprang up in the Garden of Eden after sin. Didn't know if you knew, but that's my biblical argument right there. So I think the Hebrew word translated thorns and thistles is actually the Hebrew word Brussels sprouts. But this idea that everything is relative at the level of truth is often labeled as a postmodernism. True, some postmodernists are that way, but just be prepared that someone who may self-identify as postmodern or be identified by others as postmodern, you may discover that they're not too keen on these absurd notions of relativism of truth like you find in the marketplace. So in fairness to them, especially the academics, they're not always so keen on describing themselves as, oh yeah, it's true for you that the sun shines, but that's not true for me. There's like, well, no, that's absurd. All right? But nevertheless, I have, and I won't take the time, for the sake of time, I won't go into some quotes, but you can get the slide deck of several contemporary, non-Christian as well as Christian, I think I've got some. I think maybe the ones I have in the deck are all the Christians. So let me take you back on that. Quotes for Christians who identify as postmodern that have this misunderstanding of faith, where they basically think, in a sense, it is a relativism, that it's just your sort of starting place, and you just by faith accept Christianity, and then from that point it determines everything else you think is true or false, and you have the other options over there. And if you say, well, how do I adjudicate the two? It depends on which of these guys you ask as to whether or not and how you would actually go through that. But I'll leave it for you to dig up the slide deck. Let me get then to how I would characterize what I call the classical view. I mean, that's a tendentious term. I'm arguing that this is a historical view, but I don't mean by that, because this is the historical view, that makes it the correct view. I think it's a pretty good recommendation in the church, if it's something Christians have embraced for most of the 2 millennia, that's a pretty good reason to consider it, at least, and consider its most formidable defenders before one just throws it away. But I don't want to sound like I've made my case that it's true merely by showing that it's more or less the traditional view. But I do think that it is, or as I call it, the classical view. What is that? So here's how the classical view would define reason and faith. Reason is believing something on the basis of demonstration. On the basis of demonstration. What does that mean? Well, it depends on what the statement is about. If it's a mathematical claim, if a person understands the claim and understands the demonstration that demonstrates the truth of that claim, then that would be said to believe something by reason. My favorite example is Fermat's last theorem. And the reason it's my favorite is because I get to say the name Fermat. Because growing up in the South, I don't get to roll my R's that often. Okay? But Pierre de Fermat was a 17th century mathematician. And he wrote a lot of theorems and postulates and stuff in mathematics. And every one of his theorems that he ever wrote in all of his writings that we have, every one of them has been proven either to be true or false, except one. And one of his theorems, they've never been able to prove whether he's right or wrong. And the theorem is basically a version of the Pythagorean theorem, x squared plus y squared equals z squared. And Fermat said that equation has no solutions in integers where it's greater than squared. In other words, there's no x to the third plus y to the third equals z to the third. There's no x to the fourth plus y to the fourth in whole numbers. And so as he's writing about it, he says, I found the most ingenious proof, but it's too small to fit in the margin where he was writing this in the margins of a book that he was reading. And this is 17th century. And he never mentions it anywhere else. So all the mathematicians are going, is Fermat right or wrong? And it's the longest enduring math enigma until the late 90s, 1998. And Andrew Wiles of Princeton University proved that Fermat's last theorem was true. his proof is 111 pages in the Annals of Mathematics journal, which you can get off the internet. You can actually get the summary of the proof on a t-shirt, which is hilarious. Okay, so I'm not a mathematician, so in fact, I saw a documentary on it, and they said it were principles of mathematics that didn't even exist in the 17th century. That just had no concepts. There's no way that Fermat had some clever proof of that. Now, here's the point of the illustration. If somebody asked me, well, Richard, do you believe Fermat's last theorem is true? I would say yes. But do I understand it by the basis of demonstration? No, I can't understand. Okay, then why do you believe that Fermat's theorem is true? And the answer to that illustrates the definition of faith. Whereas reason is believing something on the basis of demonstration, faith is believing something on the basis of authority. Now, eventually what we're interested in is what we come to believe to be God's authority through the Bible. That's what we mean. But just as the term is used, it just means believing something on the basis of authority. So, do I believe that Fermat's theorem is true? Yes. Do I understand the definition? I mean, the demonstration? No. Well, then you're unreasonable in believing it. No, I'm not unreasonable, because the mathematician says it's true. I would be unreasonable if somebody walked in here and said, "Hey, everybody, I'm an investment financier, and if you all give me, $1,000, I'll turn it around, double it in 6 months." Well, we'd be foolish to give him our $1,000, wouldn't we? We would say, well, let me see your portfolio, and who do you know, and what's kind of endorsements, and blah, blah, blah. We would investigate. But no matter how much we investigated, there would come a point where we would have to decide whether we were going to trust him with our $1,000 or not. You still have to decide whether you're going to do it. And that little element of, I'm entrusting you with my 1,000, begins, I think, to capture what we mean by faith. But the key to not miss is, what you put your faith in is something that is demonstrable by reason. For example, I can know by reason that Andrew Wiles is a professor of mathematics at Princeton University, or he was at the time. And his associates from a consortium of high-level mathematics departments all agreed. They vetted it, they did, You would be a fool not to believe that, even though technically I haven't seen and understood the demonstration. So a demonstration then that you believe by reason could be, again, I gave a mathematical, but ask somebody what the speed of light is. We'll all say something to the effect, I'm still stuck in the imperial system, you have to forgive me. Say, well, it's approximately 186,000 miles a second. Well, I didn't get some stuff. Whoa, that was the fastest thing, like the speed of light is 180. I didn't test the speed of light. How do I know that it's 186? Well, that's what the physicists tell me. Do I think I'm a fool for believing what physicists tell me? Well, no. I think you'd be a fool for not believing. So, not to give away my punchline, Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris thinks we're fools for believing what our Bible tells us about things that we can't demonstrate. I can't demonstrate that I'm going to rise from the dead. Well, why do you believe you're going to rise from the dead? Well, Jesus told me I was going to rise from the dead. Well, who is he? Well, he's the Son of God. Well, how do you know he's the Son of God? Well, there are prophecies made that he fulfilled. He predicted his own death and resurrection. He performed miracles and exorcisms and resurrections of his own. And all this evidence. Well, how do you know this? Because we got these documents of eyewitnesses that wrote about it. Well, how do you know they're eyewitnesses? For that matter, even if they were eyewitnesses, how do you know that what you have today, that's 2,000 years ago? How did it get from them to us? All of that stuff is all demonstrable by reason. But at some point, I have to decide whether I'm going to trust what Jesus tells me on these things that I can't demonstrate with any faculty that I have as a human being. Am I going to take him at his word? But what frustrates me about some of these atheists particularly, I would want to ask one if I ever got the chance. I go, let me ask you, if you thought there actually was an omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving creator, if you really thought there was that, do you think I would be a fool for believing what this God tells me? I mean, how could they possibly go, yeah, that's stupid. Who would want to believe in all-loving, omniscient, omnipotent beings? Like, are you kidding me? Because what you already believe is so much short of that. Why wouldn't you believe that? Now, they might say, well, I don't believe there is an all-loving. Okay, that's fine. That's a fair debate to have, whether there is this being. But you treat us as if as if we're just picking something out of thin air and staking our entire eternity on it, as if we didn't think about this. Maybe some Christians do that, perhaps. But I'm just saying, the best thinkers that we produced over the millennia, they haven't done that. And have you availed yourself to what they did? So, believing something on the basis of demonstration, that's reason. Believing something on the basis of faith, that's because of authority, is faith. Let me give you just a couple of quotes so that you'll know that I'm not just making this up. Here's Augustine. Augustine says, "For who cannot see that thinking," that's reason, "is prior to believing," that's faith. "For no one believes anything unless he has first thought that it is to be believed." Right? So you don't just arbitrarily believe things. You do a reflection on whether it's something that you ought to believe. Well, you may not ultimately be able to say, "I ought to believe it because I understood the demonstration," because that would just be believing it by reason. But you may think, "I ought to believe it because the person telling it to me is a person of authority that I can trust." Well, how do you know? Because reason can tell me that they're an authority that I can trust. And there's several quotes from Augustine. Aquinas says it this way: "Those things which are beyond the power of our understanding are said to be absent from the senses of the mind. Hence our understanding cannot be fixed on them." He's using the metaphor like how your eyes are fixed on something. But if it's something beyond your understanding, your mind can't fix on it in exactly the same way. As a result, we cannot assent to them on our own witness, but on that of someone else. These things are properly called objects of faith. He goes on, "One who believes, that is, has faith, gives assent to things that are proposed to him by another person in which he himself does not see," that is, doesn't fully understand it and able to demonstrate it. And then one more, because I like Aquinas so much. "Since man can only know the things that he does not himself see by taking them from another who does see them, and since faith is among the things we do not see, the knowledge of the objects of faith must be handed on by one who sees them himself." And he goes on to say, in the context of his Christian faith, and this is God. Again, we can know that there's a God. I would argue that reason can demonstrate God in his attributes, minus maybe the Trinity or some of the revealed attributes. I think that can be done. I think reason can demonstrate the integrity of the New Testament and how it's come down to us through 2,000 years of history and these kinds of things. And then it presents me with this gospel message. I still have to decide whether I'm going to trust what I have come to believe by reason to be a word from God. Now, John Calvin says this. See, I want to hit in the longer version, I hit a spectrum. I got Catechism of the Catholic Church, but I also have John Calvin. Calvin says, therefore in reading the profane authors, these would be the pagan scientists and philosophers of the classical era. Therefore, in reading the profane authors, the admirable light of truth displayed in them should remind us that the human mind, however much fallen and perverted from its original integrity, is still adorned and invested with admirable gifts from the Creator. In fact, I do another presentation, part of which I'm going to do. It's a long one I do in class, but it will be my second breakout. It's titled Defending the Handmaid. Having the handmaid is a metaphor used for the role philosophy plays as theology being the queen of the sciences. You've heard that metaphor before. Theology is the queen of the sciences, meaning it's really, because in the medieval court, the queen was really calling the shots. The king was just titular. Well, the handmaid to theology was often regarded to be philosophy's role. So I'm going to do that, and I have a lot more quotes from Calvin and others for my fellow Christians who have such an allergy to what they think is the enemy of philosophy. And I know it's self-serving for me to say, but I'll give that argument later. John Owen, a 17th century Congregationalist, he's been considered by some the most brilliant Christian to ever write in English. His volumes are 16 volumes. I have no idea why I'm doing my hands like this. Because it's like digital. So, I mean, you can get it printed, though it actually is. He says, there are sundry cogent arguments which are taken from external considerations of the Scripture that evince it on rational grounds to be from God, and are necessary into the confirmation of our faith, herein against temptations, oppositions, and objections. One last quote. Stephen Charnock, who was a 17th century pastor, he wrote a book it's now titled Discourses upon the Existence and Attributes of God. Ooh, it's a page turner. Honey, want to go out for dinner and a movie? Are you kidding? I'm ready to discourse about the existence of good. I got to see how this one ends. The only place you find that book today in use is probably a graduate above level theology or philosophy of religion course. The book is a collection of sermons he preached to 17th century English farmers. Now, I can't speak for Burke Community Church, but I can speak for churches that I've been members of or have known about through others in the South. They would run you out on a rail if you tried to preach that depth from the pulpit that Charnock preached to 17th century farmers. I think it's a commentary on 20th and 21st century American Christianity, but that's another subject. So let me end with this, and then we'll have time for, sometimes they say, would you be willing to do a Q&A? And I go, I'll do Q. That way you get a lot more questions. No, we maybe take a question or two because we'll have about 4 minutes left. But when I was in college, and now my faith is sort of coming back into shape, and Southern Baptists, I don't know if they still do this, but they would have opportunities for college students to steal away for 10 weeks out of their summer to do missions, either international or domestic. So I did that one summer. Sort of give you a taste of missionary work, and you consider maybe I want to be a missionary. And we had to do this orientation in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. And there's, I don't know how many young people were all in this auditorium, this gymnatorium, this orientation. And they said to us, okay, one thing we want you to do is just pair off with whoever's right next to you. You don't have to know them. Just pair off and get somewhere on the bleacher seats and share the gospel with one another. Because hopefully you're going to have opportunities to do that in your work these 10 weeks. So this young lady next to me, and so we just kind of sit down, and ladies first, and she said, Jesus died on the cross for us. And I said, okay, question for you. I wasn't trying to be a jerk. But I said, there were 3 people that died on Mount Calvary on Good Friday. 3 people were crucified that day. I said, what makes his death different from the other 2? And she said, I don't know. I'm thinking, that's what I'm thinking people might ask. I mean, that's what I would be wanting to go. I want to think about it right now before I'm out in the market and somebody goes, oh, lots of people died on crosses. What makes his death so different?
You're a sinless.
So the answer to address that question illustrates one last time the difference. Because I would submit to you without argument here that the fact that Jesus was crucified is a fact of history. It is demonstrable by the tools, methods, protocols, data points that historians use. It's not a mathematical question, right? That's a different kind of demonstration. It's a historical question. You can demonstrate that it's one of the most attested to events from the ancient world, the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. But the fact that his death pays for my sins, well, that's not a fact of history. That's a theological fact. That's a cosmic, spiritual fact. How do I know it pays for my sins? Because God tells me, if I trust in what he did for me on the cross, he'll give me his righteousness as a gift. As Romans 4, 4, and 5 said we started with. Well, how do I know that? I've got to trust God that's right. But I'm not a fool if I already am able to demonstrate that he died, that he was sinless, that he was the Son of God, that we have record of it, that those records are intact, that there is a God in the first place. All those things are susceptible, in my opinion, to the canons of reason. But that last step is something I can't prove and demonstrate beyond taking it on authority which I think we are more than warranted to have. So that's a matter of the faith. All right? We got 6 minutes according to my Popeye watch. It's 24 minutes past olive oil. So this is from the older ones here. Yes, sir.
Can you repeat that volume of books again?
Yes, it's John Owen, O-W-E-N, no S. And they're digital, and you can get them on Logos, I think, if any person's need. And they're also physical, and they are actually 16 physical volumes. And it's just called The Works of John Owen.
Works of John Owen.
His most famous treatise out of that 16 volume is actually published separately. It's got one of the coolest titles. It's called The Death of Death in the Death of Christ. Isn't that a cool title? Now, he's a Congregationalist. Despite that, the Calvinists like him still. He's not Presbyterian. But he is a strong Calvinist in the soteriological sense. So just be aware. He's a Dortian, if that means anything to any of you. Dortian Calvinism, 5 points, the tulip. And you're all nodding. I can tell you're all pretty theologically savvy. I knew that coming in, by the way. I knew I wasn't coming in with a bunch of chimps, even though they give this job to chimps sometimes, but nevertheless. Yeah, so John Owen, works of John Owen. And Charnock is Discourses upon the Existence and Attributes of God, which is pretty easily, is still in English print. It is probably digital by now. I think everything's digital by now. It's usually just the translations that are copyrighted, but since Owen and Charnock both wrote in English, they should be even probably downloaded. Yes, ma'am.
You didn't introduce yourself. What do you do?
I thank you for that. It's on the website of the conference, so I figured you guys didn't want to hear it again. But I'm the provost of Southern Evangelical Seminary. Judge Ginn is our president. And this is the part I'm the proudest of. I don't deserve it, but I took it instantly when they offered it. I'm the chair, the Norman L. Geisler Chair of Christian Apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary. Geisler was like a second father to me. He was my mentor at Dallas Seminary, and I was like a groupie and a roadie rolled into one throughout his ministry. And then my academic title is just Professor of Philosophy and Apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary. So my master's degree is from Ole Miss, and my PhD's from University of Arkansas. So I tell people in the South, at least I stayed in the SEC. Okay. All right, another question.
Yeah.
Yes,
Have you ever heard of David Pawson?
David.
Pawson,
I don't think so.
a British pastor. He was a teacher and pastor, and all these people you mentioned, Calvinist, and he wrote a book called Unlocking the Bible.
Oh wow.
And he actually explained the myth it is that some people, the types of Christians there are in the world, why we don't believe, faith, like you talk about faith, and that like yesterday, this Mr. I forgot his name, couple talks about wishful thinking, and he explained faith. It goes with actions.
Yes.
And that love is involved.
Yes, and that's going to get into the remember the theological
Yes.
use as a theological virtue. That's going to connect that word
Yes.
there. Yes.
That many people don't really know who God is. We come to church every week after week after week, but we don't really know Him.
Yes.
And he teaches really. That is why he said, I was never called to be a writer, but he says his teachings, and it was through the Holy Spirit. Without the Holy Spirit,
Now, David,
no one.
how do you spell his last name?
Pawson, Pawson.
P-A-W-S-O.
And yeah, it was an amazing,
Okay.
because I've been in churches, so many churches because we moved overseas many times,
Oh, that's it.
and I've never heard a teaching. And I'm not saying
Now, has he
that
got
other
some, does
pastors
he
are
have a
not
book
right.
out that I can?
Yes, it's called the Unlocking the Bible.
Unlocking the Bible.
And he has also with it a smaller book where he says Jesus was already prophesied in the Old Testament.
Yeah,
the
absolutely,
first 5
absolutely.
books is already the crucifixion and the resurrection and the
Well,
coming
thank
again.
you so much for that. I
It was
appreciate that
amazing.
so much.
It's really mind opening because
Let me take one more question before,
Yeah,
because
sure,
I want to
sure,
hear more about this.
Sure,
I want to
yeah,
hear
yeah,
in
yeah.
more detail than we can
Okay.
do this morning. I just want to make sure we yes, sir.
So in your travels, what would you say that this current generation is struggling with when we talk about reason and faith primarily? They're probably just, wrapped up in new nomenclature from older ideas. But what would you say that really the issues are that generations that are coming up are
Yeah.
dealing with?
So perhaps to my shame, I'm not as experienced and conversant with that ministry as far as what are the kids doing these days kind of thing. Especially the Gen X onward. It's just something that I only pick up from colleagues and associates that focus more on that. I do know that I have experience through a campus ministry called Ratio Christi, which is a campus apologetics ministry both in the U.S. and I go to South Africa every year for about a month at a time if my schedule allows. They're going nuts down there in apologetics. On the college campus, very often people are hungry for these objective facts,
yeah.
despite the fact that they often will shield themselves against this sort of facade of equality, diversity, or equity, diversity, and inclusion nonsense. they still, I think, there's something about their human nature that they can't retire. In fact, there's a great quote from Stephen Charnock that basically says, hey, the guy can talk about all he wants to about what he doesn't believe about God, but he can't retire his human nature, and he can't retire the creation he lives in. And from that common ground, we can leverage an argument. I think you see that that's true, that despite a lot of this nonsense that's layered on top of the conversation, you have an opportunity to drill down enough, you'll tap into the quick of the soul there, and there's people that want to hear it. We're done?
We're done.
We're done, okay. My timekeeper I wanted to get him before he got the tomatoes out. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you.